Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not that person. Oh, yeah, I'm actually from the University of Delaware, uh, Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. But let's, yeah. It sounds like a neat person. Let's shift gears here a little bit, and instead of talking about how urban forests would interact with the physical environment, let's talk a little bit about how they might interact with the biological environment. So I'm going to talk about essentially their role in terms of restoring biodiversity. And the reason I want to talk about that is that we actually are losing our biodiversity. You people know this. There's lots of statistics. You know what that butterfly is, by any chance? No, that's the regal fritillary. And nobody knows that because it's gone. I mean, it's a endangered species. Only a couple populations left. How about this bird? Oh, okay, you do know that. Well, that's good. Well, it's lost 97% of its population, and it represents 127 species of neotropical migrants in steep decline. So those are just a couple of representatives of the fact that important components of biodiversity are declining at a steady pace. And it brings up the question of how many species do we need? I mean, does this matter? Can we lose these species and is it going to affect us? We'll be anthropocentric about it. And actually, ecologists have been asking this question for 50 years now, starting with Robert MacArthur, where he proposed the law of nature. He said there was actually a one-to-one correspondence between the number of species in an ecosystem and ecosystem function. And you can measure that in many different types of ways. So he proposed this, and since nobody could measure it, he just called it the law of nature, and that was good. It sounded good. And then in 1981, Ann and Paul Ehrlich came up with the Rivet Hypothesis. We're all familiar with this, where they likened species in an ecosystem to rivets on an airplane. And they actually said there's a great deal of redundancy in the number of species in an ecosystem. And you could lose a lot of species until you got to some critical threshold, and then the plane would crash. Then you'd start to lose ecosystem services. But again, nobody really was measuring this. Well, now we are measuring it. There's some long-term studies that have been published. Several were published this year. And what we're finding is that there really is no redundancy out there. Apparently, MacArthur was pretty close to right. And that is, as soon as we start to lose species from ecosystems, we start to lose ecosystem function. So that in itself is a problem. But it also, from a restoration perspective, is an opportunity, because as soon as we add species to ecosystems, we increase ecosystem function. We're managing all these ecosystems now. So if we're going to build urban forests, the more species that we get in there, and the more species that are the more species of trees or plants that are themselves maintaining other species, the higher our ecosystem functions, our ecosystem services and other things will be. So that's good news. And that, as I'm saying, that's all because of the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services. Now, we've really hit our ecosystems hard since we came here in 1600. There were 950 million acres of virgin forest east of the Mississippi. We cut it all down. And now it's tiny habitat patches of secondary growth forest. And this is where the biodiversity has to maintain itself these days. It's not doing a good job. These species are disappearing because those spaces really are not big enough. And that's why our parks and preserves are not keeping these species happy and healthy. They are simply too tiny. When you take a large space, like 950 million acres, and you shrink it down to a small space, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. Good times that go up, bad times that go down. If you're a large population, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can rebuild quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, in your down cycle, you often hit zero. And you blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. And unless something recolonizes that habitat patch, you're permanently gone. That's local extinction. And when we think about extinction, we should not think about global extinction. If you want functioning ecosystems, you need those species right in that ecosystem. Having them in the Congo is not going to help us here. So local extinction is really what we have to think about. And if you think about your front yard, there's a lot of local extinction there, believe me. So there are a lot of studies, some of these are 100 years old, that are all saying the same thing. Our natural areas are not large enough to support the biodiversity that we need to run the ecosystems, to produce those ecosystem services that we're all depending on. So fragmentation essentially is the problem. These spaces are too small to maintain the biodiversity, which means corridors or some kind of biological connectedness is the solution. So what is between those natural habitats? Well, we're between there. I mean, that's where we live, that's where we work, that's where we farm. And where I live, this is what it looks like. That's our urban forest right there. So I'm throwing suburban in there too, because let's just talk about it all together. We've got to restore these forests and all of these managed ecosystems pretty much everywhere if we're going to build that connectivity between those isolated habitat fragments. And we absolutely have to, because if we do make livable spaces between those natural areas, then they're not isolated anymore. And if they're not isolated anymore, when the populations within them won't be tiny anymore, and when they fluctuate, they won't disappear anymore. So that's really at least my plan in terms of stopping the extinction crisis that's ongoing and maybe actually starting to rebuild things. Problem, of course, is that we have not built landscapes with the idea of having them be biological refuges. We've built them really from an aesthetic perspective pretty much alone. So our managed ecosystems, our urban forests, support very little biodiversity these days. How are we going to put it back? We can put it back if we understand where it comes from and how to manipulate it. Where does animal diversity come from? Well, it comes from plants. That's where the urban forests come from. And the more urban forests we have, the more plants we have, the more biodiversity, more animal life we can have. And that, of course, is because plants are the first trophic level. They're capturing the energy from the sun. They're converting it to simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the basis of every food web on this planet, with the exception of some sulfur-based food webs at the bottom of the ocean. But they are the ones that are sustaining all the other life forms. So quite literally, plants are a matter of life and death. If you have them, you have the opportunity for life. If you don't, you don't. So is that all we have to do is add plants to our urban forests to create them, and everything will be okay? Well, remember why we're doing that. If we're doing it from a perspective of maintaining food webs, we have to add the right plants, because all plants are not equal in their ability to support food webs. It's too bad that they're not, because it would make it easy, but they're not. And this is an example. This is autumn olive, genus Elaeagnus. Some people call it ugly Agnes, and I like that name. And they're calling it ugly Agnes because it was a plant that evolved in Asia, was brought over here as an ornamental 100 years ago, but it's since escaped and is one of our many invasive species, which means it's displacing native plant communities. Now, if ugly Agnes, and it's pretty easy to find monocultures of ugly Agnes out there, and it's one of 3,400 species of non-native plants that are displacing native plant communities. If these non-native plants were the ecological equivalent of the native plants they were displacing, and they are displacing, then that wouldn't matter. It'd be okay. Our ecosystems would look different, but they still would function just as well. So the question is ugly Agnes as good at supporting food webs as something like black cherry? And that is what my research has focused on for the past several years. And the answer is no, they're lousy at it because they're lousy at supporting native insect populations. I'm going to give you one data set. Maybe. There we go. This is a comparison of caterpillars in invaded hedgerows in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania versus uninvaded hedgerows. So here's ugly Agnes in this hedgerow, along with many other species, privet and burning bush and porcelain berry and oriental bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle, all the things that are now comprising our natural areas. If we compare caterpillars collected in a standardized way with a hedgerow that is almost entirely uninvaded, it's native vegetation, we find 5 times more species of caterpillars in the uninvaded hedgerows. I think our battery's going again. And 22 times more species, or more caterpillars themselves, which means these non-native plants are lousy at making caterpillars. Does that matter? Well, it matters if you eat caterpillars, and this is where the rest of the food web comes in. This is a common yellowthroat. This guy is trying to feed his babies. His nest is right down here, a mouthful of caterpillars. If he's in an area that's got 22 times fewer caterpillars, he's going to have to forage 22 times harder to get the same amount of bird food. And of course, he can't do that. So the prediction is you'll have 22 times less bird biomass when you take away that much food. And we've got a lot of publications all saying the same thing, and that's just work from my lab. There's a lot of labs saying, I mean, this is standard plant-insect interaction theory from back in the 70s that says insects are going to do best on the plants they co-evolved with. Why is that? Why are insects not doing real well with novel plants? Now, I know you engineers tend to think of plants as all being the same, and insects can eat anything, but that's an urban legend here in urban forestry. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make them either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really good defense. If you don't believe me, when you go outside, eat a leaf and see if you like it. You're not going to like it. But we do know that insects can eat plants. So how do they do that? They do that by specializing. They pick one plant lineage and they say, I'm going to get good at getting around that. I'm going to develop the enzymes and the behavioral adaptations, the physiological adaptations, life history adaptations that allow me to eat that plant without dying. But that takes a long evolutionary exposure to that particular plant lineage. It does not happen overnight. That's why Ugly Agnes has been here 100 years and there's still very few things that can eat it. Phragmites has been here 400 years and there's only 5 species that have adapted to it. Whereas in England or in Europe, there's 175 species that eat Phragmites. So this type of adaptation takes a long time. Monarch butterfly is a perfect example of a specialist, and it's one we all know. It's a specialist on milkweeds, which means it's a specialist on cardiac glycosides. Those are the compounds that are protecting milkweeds. So when you're eating plants, don't eat a milkweed because cardiac glycosides will stop your heart. That's what it does. Doesn't stop the monarch's heart, and they do have a heart, because they've got those physiological adaptations that allow them to eat this plant without dying. And that's the upside of specializing. The downside of specializing is that now that's all the monarch can eat. So if we landscape with plants that don't include Asclepias, don't include milkweeds, we're not going to have any monarchs. That's what specializing does. This is a double-toothed prominent. It is a specialist on elm, which means it has the adaptations for eating elm, but also it illustrates another advantage of being a specialist. Now you can look like what you're eating. And of course, this gives us protection from the birds. Birds actually hunt caterpillars by looking for caterpillar damage. So this guy's sitting in the area that he's eaten and pretending he's the edge of the leaf, and he says there's no damage here, and the bird flies on. So that's another advantage of being a specialist. But if the Dutch elm disease comes and takes out the elm, or if we build our urban forest with something other than elm, we don't have the double-toothed prominent. This is a leaf-footed bug, Korean bug that only eats ash. If the emerald ash borer takes out all our ashes, we lose this guy. I think there's 44 species of ash specialists that would disappear if we lose that genus of plants. And that's the problem. 90% of our insect herbivores are specialists, just like the ones I've just talked about. So again, if we build our urban forest out of plants, a hodgepodge of plants from someplace else, we're going to lose 90% of the insect herbivores that are the basis of the food webs that could be maintained in those settings. Who cares? Well, this is the crux of it. Who cares, of course, are all the things that eat those insects. And it turns out it's an awful lot of things. Insects are crucial to food webs. All spiders eat insects, or they eat other spiders that eat insects. Other insects eat insects. Tremendous diversity of insect predators out there are relying on those insect herbivores. Our frogs eat insects, toads, amphibians, all of the amphibians are eating insects. Even our freshwater fish, I just learned this year, are eating terrestrial insects that fall into the stream. 60% of the protein comes from terrestrial insects. So if we line our streams with Japanese knotweed, nothing is falling into the stream, and they're losing 60% of their protein. Lizards eat insects, bats eat insects. Come on. Even our rodents eat insects. Because insects are really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are high in lipids, high energy compounds that allow these small animals to grow quickly and reproduce quickly, which they have to do because there's a lot of things that want to eat them. But same reason that bigger things are eating insects. The skunk is digging up your lawn to get the grubs that are in your lawn. Even things we don't think of, as insectivores? Well, possums, foxes. We don't think of them as insectivores, but they eat a lot of insects. So do black bears. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. Even things that don't eat insects rely on insects. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. I do have pictures of it carrying dragonflies, but it eats other birds. But you can't take the insects out of this guy's food web and still have them, because the birds that it eats depended on the insects to become birds. There they are, baby birds. You know how many baby birds need insects? All of them. Not all of them, 96%. This is a list of the terrestrial bird families in North America that rear their young on insects, or the book will say other arthropods. And the other arthropods are the spiders that needed insects to become spiders. 96% of our birds. We are so used to landscaping for birds as if, as if they were berry and seed eaters. Some of them are, but not when they're reproducing. And reproduction happens to be the limiting factor of the size of our bird populations. If you don't reproduce, it doesn't matter how many berries you eat in the wintertime. You're going to be gone. So I'm going to just generalize and say that this brown thrasher is not going to be able to rear its offspring through to maturity if it's in a land without enough insects, and that's such a land. There again, that's our urban forest. How many insects do we need if we're going to make viable food webs in our urban spaces? Does somebody want to be operating that for me? There you go. Well, the answer is a lot. My chickadees told me that this summer. Change. They feed their babies exclusively on caterpillars. Actually, the book says 95%, but mine were exclusively caterpillars. Change. Change. Yeah. And if you look it up in the book, they are feeding between 390 and 570 caterpillars to their young each day while they're in the nest. And they do that for 16 days. Change. That means 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of chickadees. So think about your yard and think about whether you're making that many caterpillars. And if you're not going to have one clutch of chickadees. That's one species of tiny bird. Change. And this type of landscape is not going to do that. That's Bradford pear, that's blue spruce, doesn't belong here. It's not part of our local food webs. If we're having million tree initiatives to put the trees back in our forests and we build them out of 1 million Bradford pears, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Change. So you might think the solution is simply to plant native plants. Change. But all native plants are not equal in their ability to support food webs either. So we need to put the ones that are the most effective into our landscapes, if that's part of our goal. And I'm going to argue that it should be. This is a ranking of all the woody plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states. So let's say we're going to build our forest out of woody plant genera. And the little numbers after each plant genus are the number of species of caterpillars, the number of species of bird food that each one supports. So I'm sure you've memorized that by now. But what we can do with this is now compare any two plant genera in terms of their ability to support food webs. So let's do that. Change. Let's compare tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, change, with one of the oaks, change. We go to our list and we see oaks are number 1. 534 species of caterpillars found on oaks just in the mid-Atlantic states compared to tulip tree supports 21. They're both native plants. We want both of these tree genera in our forests, but one is a whole lot better at supporting food webs than the other one. So if that becomes one of our urban forestry goals, we want to think about putting in oaks. Change. What do we need to know? What do we still need to know? We need to know a lot of things. Change. But one of them is that if we put all these plants into our urban spaces, are we creating ecological traps? This is a problem because there are a lot of things that kill biodiversity in our urban situations right now. Change. Mesopredators, cats. You see Peter Mara's research a couple weeks ago, 2.4 billion birds killed by feral cats or house cats these days. And most of that's happening in suburban urban settings. So we need to think about that. Toxins are increased in those urban settings. Window strikes, 1 billion birds are killed by windows every year. There are things we can do about this, but that's the situation right now. Road kills, 100 million birds by speeding cars, and that's just birds. So these are all sources of mortality that we want to think about. Does that mean that we shouldn't do these things in urban settings? I think not. I think we need to find ways to mitigate these problems, but change. We need to think about the trophic cascades that have occurred by removing top predators. I don't, you know, DC, you have deer down here? I've got 140 deer per square mile in southern Chester County, Pennsylvania, and the carrying capacity is 14. So serious problem. It's not the deer's fault. It's the fact that we have no redundancy in deer predators. We've gotten rid of all of them. The only predator now is the car. So that's a challenge in trying to create a balanced ecosystem in urban settings. We need to think about that. Change? There's the claim, I hear it all the time, that native plants don't do well in cities. Only plants from China. Yeah. We need to do some research and find the genotypes of the native plants that are going to support these food webs that do well in our challenging urban settings. They're out there. Nobody's looked. That's all. That's all. Change? So the reason we have to do this is that these urban settings are everywhere. They really are everywhere. And the dark spaces you see in there are largely agriculture. So if we're going to maintain the diversity of life that we need, not just in our urban centers, but everywhere, we can't ignore our urban-suburban matrix. We simply can't. Change? That's it. Thank you.